The thunder came first, not from the sky, but from the ground. A deep metallic growl, rolling closer with every heartbeat, until the floorboards beneath Greta Weber's bare feet seemed to tremble in protest. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the barracks, the smell of damp timber mixing with the sour ghost of sweat that never left the room. Without thinking, she stepped sideways, planting herself in front of the two younger women. It was the same stance she had assumed 100 times before, shoulders squared, chin lowered, body angled to absorb whatever was coming. At 23, Greta had already spent 4 years learning that survival meant offering yourself first. "American tanks," whispered Liesel, her voice a thin reed of sound. The girl's fingers twisted the fabric of her dress until it looked like rope. She had been only 16 when the Germans pulled her from the Hamburg orphanage, telling her she would be working in a factory. Instead, she had been delivered here. Her fear had never been something she could hide, her terror always shining too honestly in her eyes. On the cot near the wall, Ingrid Schneider kept her posture straight, as if she were still in front of a classroom and not in a brothel the Wehrmacht had disguised as essential war service. She was 28, a teacher once, her dignity the only thing that hadn't been stripped from her. "They'll come down the main road," she said, her German clipped and precise. Still, her knuckles were white where they gripped her blanket. The barracks fell quiet except for shallow breaths. Through the grimy window, Greta saw a rising curtain of dust, backlit by the pale April Sunday. Her mind flickered, as it often did, to that day 4 years earlier when the soldiers had come to her village. They'd told her parents she had been chosen for war work. Her mother had even pressed her best dress into her hands and slipped her grandmother's prayer book into her odd bag. The book was long gone, now traded in 1943 for a crust of bread, but the prayers still lingered in Greta's memory, though she no longer dared to speak them. The roaring engines stopped. In the sudden silence, voices barked in English outside, sharp, commanding. Greta couldn't understand the words, but the tone was universal. Men claiming territory. Boots struck gravel in perfect unison, the unmistakable rhythm of military drill. "Stay behind me," Greta whispered, though she knew the words meant nothing. There was no back door, no tunnel, no escape. This was a place built for containment, not for freedom. The doorknob groaned as someone twisted it, a rusty squeal slicing through the silence. Greta lifted her chin, a fraction, not defiant, but refusing to cower. She knew from bitter experience that being discovered hiding always ended worse. Sunlight knifed into the dim barracks as the door opened. In its glare stood a tall figure in American uniform, flanked by soldiers whose faces were far too young, far too clean. Their khaki still smelled of soap and starch, not of whiskey or sweat. Greta scanned the officer's expression, searching for the familiar glint of hunger, of cruelty. Instead, she saw something else: shock, then recognition, and almost pity. He spoke carefully in halting German. "We're not going to hurt you, you're safe now." The words landed in the stale air like a miracle too fragile to touch. Greta's heart lurched, torn between disbelief and the faintest stirring of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The truck bed smelled of canvas and sun-warmed wood, not of diesel or unwashed bodies. Greta sat wedged between Liesel and Ingrid, their shoulders pressed tightly together. For years, the three had been separated and shuffled at the whims of men. This was the first journey where no one dragged one of them away to another officer's vehicle. The soldier driving never barked orders, never reached to grab an arm. Instead, when Liesel balked at his outstretched hand, he wordlessly set down a wooden crate as a step, waiting until she climbed up on her own. That silent courtesy unsettled them more than any shouted command could have. Through the open flap, Greta watched the Bavarian countryside roll by. Tanks had chewed the fields into scars, yet spring grass was pushing through the soil, stubborn and green. The war was ending. Everyone said so. But Greta had learned that endings rarely meant deliverance for women like them. A change in flags usually just meant new masters. The convoy wound through valleys and finally crested a hill where rows of tents sprawled below an entire city of khaki and canvas. Camp Lucky Strike. At its edge, fences bristled with wire. Greta's stomach twisted. Fences were always the same, no matter the language on the guards' lips. The truck ground to a halt at a squat wooden building marked with a red cross. Again, the soldiers stepped back, letting the women climb down on their own. Greta noticed the driver's careful gestures, hands always visible. Movements announced in German before they approached. The smallest details. To men, trivial. To them, everything. A tall sergeant emerged from the doorway. His hair was silvering at the temples, and deep lines fanned from his eyes, creases earned by smiling as much as frowning. He spoke in deliberate, heavily accented German. "My name is Sergeant Morrison. You will stay in Building 7. Clean, secure. No one will enter without permission." Permission? Permission? Liesel echoed, the word sounding absurd in her mouth, like a relic from another world. Morrison led them past rows of American soldiers who looked up from cards and letters. Some stared with curiosity, but none jeered or reached. The silence of restraint felt as alien as the fences. Building 7 was no palace, but to the three women it might as well have been. 6 cots lined the walls, each with a folded wool blanket, and a wooden crate for belongings. Greta let her fingers brush the fabric. It was soft, clean, the sort of blanket someone had taken time to wash, not one heavy with the stink of men. For the first time in years, she didn't recoil from touch, she sought it. Morrison produced a sheet of paper, German words written in block letters. He pinned it to the wall. Rule 1. No prisoner will be harmed. Rule 2. No soldier may enter without permission. Rule 3. Meals will be delivered at 0800, 1200, and 1800. The women stared at the paper, as though it were written in some sacred script. Ingrid whispered, almost to herself, "Is this real?" As if to answer, a young guard appeared, barely older than Liesel, holding a steaming pot. His German was broken, his cheeks red with embarrassment. Soup. Hot soup. When he reached to hand Liesel a bowl, she recoiled violently, nearly toppling onto the cot. The boy froze, horror-stricken. "Sorry, very sorry. No hurt." Morrison stepped in gently, correcting him. "Announce. Keep distance. Let them come." The boy nodded, retreating, his shame written plainly across his face. For long moments, the women only stared at the pot. It smelled of carrots, beef, and parsley, real food. Not thin broth. Greta's hand trembled as she reached for a bowl, braced for the price that would be demanded, but no price came. Only the distant laughter of American soldiers outside, sounding like men in a world she had almost forgotten could exist. By the third day, the miracle had begun to take on a rhythm. At exactly 8 o'clock, 2 quick knocks echoed against the wooden door, followed by Johnson's voice announcing himself in halting German. "Breakfast. Permission to enter?" Only after a pause would the door creak open, and the tray be set down just inside. He never crossed farther. Greta had lived 4 years at the mercy of men who believed they owned every second of her existence. Yet, here was a boy, no older than 20, who treated the simple act of delivering food as though it were a sacred duty. Still, trust was not something she could will into being. At night, Greta lay on her cot, wide awake, listening. She expected the familiar tramp of boots outside, the leering voices demanding entry. Instead, the camp seemed to exhale a kind of ease, laughter from card games, faint music from a radio, the murmur of men writing letters home. It was almost too peaceful, too dangerous to believe. But her body betrayed her. The wound in her shoulder, hidden carefully beneath her dress for weeks, had grown hot and swollen. She had survived. Worse, by silence, she knew men's cruelty doubled when they saw weakness. That morning, as she tried to lift her arm and failed, Ingrid noticed. "You're injured," Ingrid said, her tone carrying that teacher's authority she had never lost. Liesel's eyes widened, terrified of what attention might bring. Greta wanted to deny it, but the truth throbbed with every heartbeat. When Johnson arrived with lunch, Ingrid surprised herself. She stepped forward, chin high, and in practiced English said, "Medical help, please." The boy froze for an instant, then bolted. Minutes later, he returned with a compact man, whose uniform bore the Red Cross armband. His skin was darker, his eyes sharp and calm. "I am Corporal Chin," he said in smooth German, his voice carrying a quiet certainty. He placed his medical bag on the table and began laying out instruments, bottle of antiseptic, rolls of clean bandage, powdered sulfa, but he did not touch her. Instead, he looked at Greta directly. "I need to examine your wound. Is that acceptable to you?" The question nearly unmade her. Acceptable? She had not been asked that word in 4 years. For a long moment, she could only stare at him. Finally, in a whisper, she said, "Yes." Chin worked with the care of a craftsman, explaining each step as though she were a partner in her own healing. The antiseptic burned, but his hands were steady, his touch clinical. Greta studied his face, searching for that inevitable flicker of hunger, of calculation. It never came. There was only focus, and an almost stubborn gentleness. When he finished, he taped the dressing neatly. "Your body can heal, if given time and safety. You have both here." He packed his bag and left without another word, leaving behind silence so thick the 3 women could barely breathe. Liesel was the first to speak, wonder brightening her frightened eyes. He asked first. That evening, Morrison visited as he often did, his presence less command than reassurance. Ingrid, usually composed, asked with trembling voice, "The Red Cross, can they send letters?" Morrison's weathered face softened. "Yes, they specialize in finding family." Ingrid's lips parted, and words she had not spoken aloud in years escaped. "My sons, 11 years old now, twins." The sergeant's nod was quiet but firm. "We'll start tomorrow." That night, for the first time, the 3 women spoke not of fear, but of memories, of gardens, of children, of impossible futures. Their voices rose stronger, no longer whispers but the beginnings of belief. Outside, the camp hummed with ordinary life, and for a fleeting moment, tomorrow felt like something to look forward to. The next morning, a strange heaviness hung over Camp Lucky Strike. Soldiers moved differently, more subdued, their laughter muted. Greta noticed it first in the way Johnson avoided their eyes as he delivered breakfast, his boyish smile strained. She exchanged a glance with Ingrid, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Change in a soldier's mood always carried meaning, and meanings could be dangerous. By midday, the source arrived. Morrison appeared at their door, his weathered face grim. Beside him stood a new figure, a compact man with hard eyes, his stance sharp as if he were carved from stone. "This is Corporal Sullivan," Morrison said in deliberate German. "He'll be with our unit for some weeks." Sullivan's gaze swept the room. It was not the gentle concern of Johnson, nor the clinical distance of Chin. It was the look of a man weighing evidence. When his eyes lingered on Greta, she felt herself shrink inside, not from fear, but from the sharp edge of judgment. He nodded stiffly toward Ingrid. "Ma'am," his German clipped. The undertone in his voice was enough to make Liesel press closer to Greta's side. After they left, silence lingered. The fragile routine they had begun to build felt like glass, a single crack threatening to shatter it all. For 2 days, that unease spread like smoke. The guards kept their distance, conversations cut short as the women passed. Johnson still knocked politely, but his movements seemed rehearsed now, forced. It was Corporal Chin who broke the silence. He arrived to check Greta's healing shoulder, but his usual calm was strained. "The men have seen new film," he explained quietly, his German steady but heavy. "Footage from the camps, piles of bodies. Children starved. Executions. For many of them, it is the first time they understand what this war was truly about." He tied off Greta's fresh bandage and met her eyes. Some struggle to see the difference between victims and perpetrators. That afternoon, Sullivan returned, this time without Morrison. He carried a folder under his arm, his jaw set tight. "Questions," he said flatly, stepping inside. He spread several black and white photographs across the crate table. Grainy images of skeletal figures behind wire, mass graves, hollow-eyed children. The air in the room seemed to collapse under the weight of the pictures. "What did you know?" Sullivan's voice was cold. "What did you see?" Liesel gasped, covering her mouth. Ingrid's back stiffened. Greta felt the bottom drop from her chest. Not surprise, but confirmation of something she had always sensed in whispers. She knew cruelty. She had lived it. But this systematic extermination was cruelty industrialized. "They told us we were lucky," Liesel burst out, tears streaking her cheeks. "They said we could have been sent to camps instead. We thought they meant factories." Ingrid's voice was steady but bitter. "They told us we were serving the Reich, that our sacrifice spared other women worse fates." She almost spat the words, her teacher's clarity cutting through her anguish. Sullivan's eyes burned with disgust. "How do we know you are not guilty too, that you were not part of it?" The question cracked something inside Greta. She had built walls of endurance, of survival, but this pierced through. Her voice came raw. "Maybe we are guilty. Maybe surviving makes us guilty. Maybe we should have died." Sullivan gathered the photographs, his silence sharper than any accusation, and walked out. The door closed with a finality that left the three women huddled in the fading light, shame pressing down like a physical weight. Outside, the camp carried on with its evening routines, voices, laughter, the clatter of mess kits. But inside Building 7, those sounds felt like a different world, a world where they no longer belonged. For 3 days after Sullivan's interrogation, the women moved like shadows. They accepted their meals with downcast eyes, their murmured thanks fading into silence. Greta found herself mentally preparing for the inevitable. The moment when someone would knock at their door, not with soup or bandages, but with orders, reassignment, punishment, a return to the life she thought she'd escaped. She began cataloging every kindness she'd received since arriving. The clean blankets, the antiseptic sting of Corporal Chin's care, the simple dignity of permission asked. Each one felt like stolen property she would soon have to surrender. Liesel retreated into the kind of manic quiet she'd once used to endure long nights, rocking slightly on her cot and staring at nothing. Ingrid sat rigid and watchful, her teacher's mind trying to build some logical framework where innocence and guilt could be separated, like arithmetic. But in a world where children starved behind barbed wire, what did those words even mean anymore? On the fourth morning, the door opened, and Morrison stepped in. Sullivan was behind him, his hard face now unreadable. Morrison carried a document folder, official-looking, with the weight of authority. Greta's stomach clenched. This was it, she thought. The reckoning. The judgment that would strip away their brief illusion of safety. But the sergeant didn't speak like a man delivering a verdict. His voice was quiet, almost paternal. "What happened in those camps?" Morrison said, eyes steady on Greta. "That's not on you. And what happened to you? That's not on you either." The words landed like blows, but not of pain, of something heavier. Greta's mind, conditioned to expect betrayal, struggled to fit them into any recognizable shape. Sullivan shifted behind Morrison, his posture rigid but his eyes conflicted, as if something inside him was cracking. "These women survived hell," Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength. "They're not the enemy, they're the evidence of what we've been fighting against." He turned slightly, including Sullivan, in the weight of his gaze. Sullivan's jaw tightened, then loosened. He looked at Greta again, not as an accusation, but as a man seeing a person for the first time. "How old were you?" he asked in halting German, "when they took you?" 19, Greta whispered. The number felt impossibly small, like a child's. Sullivan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had shifted. "Jesus," he breathed in English. "My sister, she's 19, at home in Ohio." He extended his hand toward Greta, not to take, not to claim, but to offer support. The gesture was so small, yet monumental. The first time in 4 years that a man had reached for her without the intent to break her. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "My brother died fighting this system. I thought my anger honored him, but he'd be ashamed of me right now. He'd want me to help you, not hurt you more." Morrison opened the folder. Not charges. Not condemnation. Red Cross paperwork and repatriation forms. "We've located Ingrid's sons," he said gently. "They're safe in American custody in Munich, healthy, asking about their mother every day." Ingrid's composure shattered like glass. She wept, not from shame or fear, but from the unthinkable sensation of hope fulfilled. Liesel reached for her with trembling hands, and for the first time in days, her young face showed something other than terror. Morrison's words lingered in the air, like a fragile bridge between despair and something new. "You'll be transferred to the repatriation center next week," he explained, laying the paperwork gently on the crate as though it were treasure. Then, his voice took on a deliberate gravity. "But before you go, I want you to understand something. Tell people what you saw here. Tell them some of us remembered you were human when the world forgot." Greta stared at him, hardly breathing. His words struck deeper than any command or promise, carving out space in her chest where guilt had lived like a parasite. For the first time, she felt the faint shape of something different, an obligation not to survive, but to testify. The room was silent except for Ingrid's sobs. Then, Greta found her voice. "Tell your families," she said, her tone gathering strength, "that 3 German women will spend the rest of their lives proving mercy is stronger than cruelty." Sullivan lowered his head, as though her words had delivered him his own kind of absolution. That night, Building 7 was not silent. The women talked until their voices were hoarse, not of fear, but of futures. Ingrid spoke of her sons and how she would not waste another second if God allowed her to hold them again. Liesel dared to whisper dreams she had long buried of teaching, of music, of anything not chained to survival. And Greta, hesitantly, spoke of her mother's garden in spring, of roses climbing the stone walls of her childhood home, and of her own decision to reclaim the years stolen from her. Outside, the camp pulsed with the rhythm of transition. Trucks rattled, carrying supplies not for destruction but for rebuilding. Soldiers wrote letters by lamplight, their laughter carrying the nervous excitement of boys ready to return home. For the first time since liberation, the women inside Building 7 did not flinch at those sounds. They let the warmth of them soak in, like sunlight through the cracks of a long winter. The war was not yet over, but its end was visible, close enough to taste. With it came a new kind of responsibility, one not defined by survival under domination, but by the fragile, necessary work of remembrance. Greta lay awake long after the camp quieted, staring at the ceiling, and realized she no longer feared tomorrow. She was 23, old enough to carry scars, but still young enough to rebuild. And as the spring breeze slipped through the barracks window, carrying the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, she finally allowed herself to imagine something that had felt impossible for 4 long years: a future.